So welcome everybody. My name is Elizabeth Noble and I'm the Manager of Donor Engagement at Sierra Club BC. And I want to acknowledge that I am currently working from my home on beautiful Lekwungen territory in Victoria, BC. I'd like to thank you all for coming today and for all of your support. And again, if you haven't already, please open the chat box and introduce yourself to the group and let us know where you're calling in from and on whose territory you're currently residing. And just make sure that you do select all panelists and attendees so everybody else can read that. So to introduce myself, I was born on Ohlone territory in San Francisco into a family of settlers that has been living somewhere on Turtle Island for the last 16 generations on my mother's side. And I hold a BFA from Concordia University in Montreal, and I've been fundraising for various arts and environmental groups for about 20 years. Let's do some basic housekeeping. So just to let you know, this webinar will be recorded, and I encourage you to use the chat box throughout the webinar if you want to communicate thoughts to each other. But we are going to be testing out a new technology for the question and answer period. We have Kat who's going to be guiding us through that. So don't use the Q&A box to direct questions to the panelists. We'll have something later in the meeting that you can use. And in the meantime, you can just use the chat to communicate with each other. So again, welcome everyone to this Forests webinar, which is part of our Resiliency in Times of Change webinar series. And I really appreciate that you've all taken the time to join this conversation. And I know there are a lot of competing demands for your time, especially in the form of webinars now that we've gone digital. So I really want to honor the fact that everyone's taken the time to join us today. It really means a lot to me personally. Next, I will introduce our panelists. So first, I've got Jens here, who is our Senior Forest and Climate Campaigner at Sierra Club BC. Jens is working for healthy communities, healthy forests, and a stable climate. His primary focus is solutions to maintain the ecological integrity and the climate stabilizing role of BC's globally rare coastal and inland temperate rainforests, old growth rainforests, excuse me, but rainforests more generally. He's been working for more than 10 years for solutions in the Great Bear Rainforest. Jens grew up on the coast of the North Sea in West Germany. Prior to coming to Canada, Jens worked as a tropical rainforest campaigner for German environmental organization Robin Wood, helping protect the rainforest of Indonesia. He also worked for a German development corporation in Nicaragua to help conservation planning in Biosphere Reserve Bosawos, the largest tropical rainforest region of Central America. Jens, do you want to say hi real quick?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Great, thank you. Our next panelist, we have our Coastal Projects lead, Mark Worthing. Mark is a multidisciplinary organizer, naturalist, and journalist who has an affinity for the wilder landscapes of British Columbia. Mark spends his time exploring coastal estuaries and rainforests, researching northern resident orcas, occupying tar sands pipelines, or learning about biodiversity in the Broughton Archipelago on the coast, or the Flathead River in the Rockies. He's a founding member of Tanker Free BC and Sea to Cedar, and is privileged to pursue work as a conservation community builder. With a background in research and logistics with Greenpeace, salmon field ecology work with coastal field stations and grassroots movements, he intersections decolonization approaches with conservation and environmentalism. Welcome, Mark.
Hey.
Great. And then we have Catherine Allen, who's joining us from Thought Exchange, who will be helping facilitate the Q&A period later in this webinar. She is an account executive at Thought Exchange, whose experience is largely in the workplace and non-for-profit sectors. She loves building meaningful relationships and connecting people. She's originally from the UK, and Kat moved to Vancouver on a whim and fell in love with the lifestyle that BC has to offer. She enjoys putting herself out of her comfort zone and learning new skills, something that Canada has offered in abundance. She's happiest outside, and when not working, you'll find her hiking up a mountain, snowboarding, camping, doing yoga, or dancing at a music festival. So thank you for joining us, Kat. Okay, well, I also just want to mention really quickly that we do have Maya, who's going to be doing some background work to make sure that this webinar runs smoothly, and she's our communications specialist. So if you see her, that's what she's doing. So first we'll hear from each of our campaigners for a few minutes, and then we'll go into the question period with Thought Exchange. And it's the first time we're trying this technology, so I really hope you'll give it a shot. But let's begin with Mark Wieting. Mark, do you want to set the stage for us and what you think about in terms of forests and resiliency?
Sure. Thanks, Elizabeth. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Forgive my elementary school kwakwala, but nukwa mamatla, nukwa gyawala gilis, hamata mumtagela. I've been thinking a lot lately about Awitnaguis and Awitnyakola. And I want to say haichka to my Cowichan and friends who have been really gracious in sharing space and sharing knowledge with me where I live in Cowichan territory here. So thinking a lot about those that are going out and working with the tree of life, with the great cedar tree right now, especially in doing bark harvesting work as it's the spring. That's one way that a lot of folks are having relations with the forest right now. So yeah, haichka, Gela Kesla, friends. I'm just going to launch right into things because I think I've got 10 minutes here, and I am going to pop some slides up, not those ones, these ones. And I'm going to pick up from where my colleagues left off last week. How does that look, everyone? With the concept of resiliency and this pandemic and the moment that we find ourselves in, Hannah Askew and Caitlin Vernon that we work with at Sierra Club talked a little bit about resiliency in these times, and they touched on this essay written by Arundhati Roy, where she writes, quote, "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our databanks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly with little baggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it." So I'd like to suggest that land stewardship work and our relationships with forests need to walk lightly through this portal like all other things. The trees and the forests themselves of British Columbia make visible the type of relationship we've cultivated with the land here. The forest keeps score. The rivers react to how we manage or mismanage our presence in these watersheds. Wild salmon returns either reward or punish us for how we've impacted their homes. And we all know the troubling trend of disappearing intact ancient rainforests, wild salmon populations, and rare and endangered species here in BC. We need to reimagine and restructure our relationship with the forest and the land itself. So if we accept that the forests and the ecosystems have kept a rather grim score of our impact on the land base, specifically the last 90 years of accelerated resource extraction with the use of truck logging that replaced steam donkeys and rail logging, then remarkably efficient road building, mechanization of logging equipment, and the endless thirst for the global market.
Can you hold that mic a little bit closer? We've just got a request for you to speak louder.
Sure. Is that any better?
Yeah.
Cool. Then we know that this trend needs to change, and fast. It needs to change so that the sector can continue supporting good-paying jobs in communities, and it needs to change so that our economies diversify towards livelihoods that have a lighter impact on the land base. So this is an invitation to you, a pause before the portal. And forgive me for indulging a different way of thinking about these issues. I would suggest that perhaps thinking differently at this moment in time is exactly what we need to do. I want to invite you to think about even the very language we use in talking about forests, how it frames our creative imaginations about what's possible. I want to invite you to question why the priorities of certain sectors and types of labor are valued differently in relation to the forests. And I want to invite you to shift your imagination from thinking about forests as a resource to exploit with a management approach, I'm looking for ways to think about my responsibility to forest ecosystems and services that they freely provide. I have more questions than I have answers, but change is about embracing that uncertainty and leaving preconceived baggage behind. So the word forest itself is from Old Latin foris, or outside. Foresta silva, later the word in French and then Middle English means a wooded area kept for hunting under royal dominion, or denoting uncultivated lands by the decree of the divine rule of kings. So in the very definition of the word forests that we use is the assumption of both the colonial ownership of land and also the assumption that it is the divine right of the crown to, quote, manage as a resource and not as a place in which we have responsibilities and complex cultural relationships with. And when we separate natural systems from human culture, it becomes acceptable to exploit that resource as some sort of splendor without limits or diminishment, as is on the British Columbia coat of arms. But of course, these landscapes have limits and they've been severely diminished. And we are at a reckoning with the sober thought that growth cannot be infinite. And naturally, in this part of the world, these forests are indigenous lands. And the people who stewarded their territories had a much different relationships with these ecosystems than a king or a crown might have presumed dominion over an area. And herein lies much of the source of conflicts on unceded territories of most of British Columbia. There's the assumption that these wild and culturally engaged landscapes are the free right of logging corporations or crown governments to manage as they see fit. But we know that these incredible ecosystems that have evolved over 10,000 plus years into one of the most incredible ecosystems, like the biodiversity and cultural diversity of these places are bar none in the world. And they are first the responsibility of Indigenous people, second, the responsibility of the general public, and third, a global treasure that we owe our highest level of thinking. So I invite you to remember that this place, which includes coastal Douglas fir ecosystems on the brink of collapse, temperate inland rainforests that are one of the rarest natural phenomenon on Earth, to the tune of 3 to 4% of the Earth's surface, and less than 1% of the Earth's surface that is coastal temperate rainforest that can even support salmon-subsidized ecosystems. I invite you to think about what our collective responsibility is towards these landscapes and what vision we can create together. We're still discovering new species of bugs that exist only in the canopies of ancient old-growth forests that are being logged and aerially sprayed with herbicides today. We're only just scraping the surface of scientific inquiry into the role of mycelial networks and their role that they play in forest ecology, communication, nutrient exchange, as led by the incredible research of Susan Simard at the University of British Columbia. All the while, BC Timber Sales auctions off the last ancient rainforest cut blocks at wholesale rates. There's an entire life cycle, an ecosystem phenomenon happening below the forest floor that we only know fragments about, and yet the words mushroom or mycelium doesn't even appear once in the entire Forest Range and Practices Act. It's possible that mycelium are as important to forests as the trees are. There's 600,000 kilometers of resource extraction roads in BC, with 10,000 more being added every year. That's like driving from here to Quebec City and back again of added human access throughout ecosystems every year. Think about how intensely that fractures habitats, migrating routes of animals, or how fundamentally it shifts predator-prey dynamics. It's not unreasonable to suggest that food sovereignty rights of Indigenous people who want to prioritize salmon over logging companies' desire to blast roads through sensitive drainages for high-graded cedar, yet this is common practice in BC. One of my teachers, the ethnobotanist Nancy Turner, wrote a book called Earth's Blanket, where she writes about her knowledge of the flora and fauna that carpets some of the Earth's surface and the forest floor. This ecological blanket, which is the source of so many foods, medicines, non-timber forest products, ancient and modern cultural practices, is also a blanket of carbon sequestration. We need to keep these sacred forest systems as they are to strengthen their climate adaptivity and resilience. With this diversity comes resilience. With resilience comes adaptation and responsiveness to change. These are basic concepts in ecology, and we have a lot of lessons to learn in mimicking these principles in our own social structures and economies. The Nuchatlit Nation of Nootka Island is using the living, breathing, old-growth forests as evidence of occupation of their title in their title case in Supreme Court currently. Bark harvested culturally modified trees still standing today are evidence of occupation and use in 1846 when the British first asserted sovereignty in their territories. Their history and cultural heritage is literally alive in the ancient forests that are sequestering carbon, providing marbled murrelet habitat, and purifying and cooling water for wild salmon streams. Yet Western Forest Products is still logging through Indigenous cultural heritage daily, and lawyers under the Attorney General, David Eby, are fighting the Nuchatlit in court alongside Western Forest Products. Critical habitat necessary for the survival of SAR-listed northern red-legged frogs, caribou, threatened steelhead salmon are all being logged at an alarming rate at the behest of the BC government on Vancouver Island, in the Great Bear Rainforest, the inland temperate rainforest, and in the Rocky Mountains. The ancient old-growth ecosystems we're fighting for are irreplaceable. It's impossible to replant ancient ecosystems with the hubris that we can manage the forests the way they've evolved for the last 250, 500, 1,000, 10,000 years of climatic conditions that created these ecosystems. They're natural hatcheries for Chinook and chum salmon that feed our beloved orcas. Their bows meet the salt water where herring spawn. They can be our greatest teachers in learning how to transform and how to root. Everything about the lifestyle we have.
Mark, I just want to let you know you're a couple minutes over your time, so if you can speed it up.
That was it. One just needs to look to the hills to see the state of the forest. So whether we're responding to a biodiversity crisis, a climate crisis, or a pandemic, we have a remarkable opportunity to accept this disruption for what it is, a portal, which we define and redefine our relations with the forests.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mark. So next we will go to Jens. Jens, can you please talk about the importance of protecting forests and forest stewardship, especially in light of climate change, species loss, having a diverse economy, and of course the COVID pandemic. And I think, Mark, you also need to stop sharing your screen so that Jens will be able to.
Yes. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. Thanks, Mark, for this beautiful introduction and overview all the issues we are faced with. I will talk a little bit about the big picture and a little bit more about the state of the forest in relation to climate change, species diversity, and the prospect for a diverse economy, and a little bit of an update of what's happening right now in terms of BC government decision making and this unique moment in time where we are in the midst of this pandemic and crucial decisions will be made in terms of economic recovery, and it's really important that we get this right. So in terms of the pandemic, we can hope for a vaccination, but looking at the climate crisis and the extinction crisis, we have no vaccination. We really have to change course. So looking at my slides here. Now they should be visible. So Mark already talked a little bit about this. Usually when we talk about why forests matter, we talk about the web of life, which is now endangered because we are logging too many of our remaining intact forests. And here we have marbled murrelet as a reminder. And we, of course, talk about the millions of people that depend on intact forest ecosystems for their livelihood. A number of sustainable economic activities and these long-term economic activities and cultural activities are at risk because of unsustainable destructive logging practices. And we are all aware that this is happening in BC too. And thirdly, the importance of our forest for a stable climate, storing carbon and giving us oxygen. So one reason why we are struggling globally and also here in British Columbia to understand just how dangerously close we are to tipping points is that environmental degradation and climate change are unfolding relatively slowly compared to a virus outbreak, for example. And it really helps to remind ourselves that all the changes that we have seen in the last decades, in the last century, have happened very quickly compared to the thousands of years of indigenous history. So interestingly, we were aware of indigenous settlement in about 10,000 years along the coast, and now we are looking at climate disruption, and we are looking at 10,000 years of a relatively stable climate. This is a publication from 2013, and we get a sense here of how quickly global temperatures are increasing and projected to continue to increase unless we really change course. And we see similar global trends with species extinction, and here in BC as well, we have close to 2,000 species at risk. And now we have a pandemic, and experts are warning us that we really have to change our way globally if we want to reduce the risk of more disease. So this is an infectious disease that spread from wildlife to humans. The majority of all emerging disease originates in wildlife, including HIV/AIDS, Ebola, SARS. And we have a rise in these wildlife-borne diseases that are linked to increasing encroachment on nature. So this is really a reminder about how fragile our existence on this planet is, and the multiple benefits of intact natural ecosystems for our health and well-being. And this virus specifically is an example of how loss of habitat in wildlife endangers human health by expanding transmission from wildlife to humans, disrupting ecosystems and biodiversity, throwing them off balance, and leaving us with fewer spaces to enjoy the mental and physical benefits of nature. So there's a lot more to say about this, but today we have very little time. We will share our slides if you're interested, and you can read up on some of these references we are using. So globally, this problem of disease is particularly related to tropical rainforests and tropical biodiversity and species richness. But since this is a global problem, we need global leadership. And it's really concerning, some of you have seen this before, that if we compare the pace, the speed in which we are logging, for example, the last old growth rainforest on Vancouver Island, we have lost about 30% of what remained 25 years ago since 1990, 30% loss. We had about 30% left of the productive old growth on the island in 1990. Today it's about 20. Looking at tropical rainforest countries, we have numbers showing that the same 25-year period, they lost about 10% of their remaining tropical rainforest. So this is not global leadership. We are failing badly, and whether it's about climate, species diversity, or a long-term economy and jobs, we have to change course. And you have all seen this before, a reminder about how much old growth once existed, in this case on Vancouver Island and the South Coast, and what remains today with very tiny areas of productive old growth forest in dark green. And a reminder about our global responsibility in terms of just how rare these temperate rainforests are. They never covered more than 0.5% of our land globally. and very high carbon storage per hectare, most of which is threatened when we allow clear-cut logging. The tallest trees on the planet. And now a lot more signs showing that old growth forests, in fact, do continue to sequester a lot of carbon. And we should not hold our breath planting trees, because it takes a long time to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. Planting trees, we really have to protect as much as possible in forests that already exist. Again, we don't have a lot of time to talk about carbon right now, but this is a reminder about our clear-cut carbon report from December 2019. Just want to remind you to read up about it if you have not have if you didn't have a chance to take a look at this. So solutions that are needed are well known. We know from experience in the Great Bear Rainforest that we need science-based conservation models. We need networks of protected areas that are large enough to sustain species and cultural values. We need ecosystem-based management, making sure that across landscapes enough is protected and multiple ecological values. This must be tied to government decision-making. It must be tied to support for sustainable economic activity, just like in the Great Bear Rainforest, where $120 million funding was made available, and we have seen reports now that more than 1,000 jobs have been created with this funding, and these are long-term jobs. And doing all of this will allow long-term forestry, knowing that we are not logging too much. And there are problems in the Great Bear Rainforest that must be solved, but the solutions are in place. Now we have to make sure that they are fully implemented, that we have monitoring and enforcement, and this really means more government capacity to address the remaining issues. So in short, we have outdated land use plans across the province. We have increasing ecological risk, few percentage points of old growth remaining. Business as usual results in more damage today, because we are already faced with climate impacts. We have a changing BC economy. We have strengthened Indigenous people's rights and new conservation models. There's growing support. We did polling showing 90% of British Columbians want to see old growth protected. We know about the solutions. What's needed is leadership. And this is a reminder that the NDP promised in their election platform that they will take action for old growth using the model in the Great Bear Rainforest. So we have the solutions, and we are in this unique moment in time right now where we are in the pandemic, the economy is suffering, and spending will be made available. And it's incredibly important to make sure that we use every single dollar to support solutions. So this means that we have to shift this economy from fossil fuels, particularly from spending and subsidizing fracked LNG terminals and the related infrastructure, and towards economic activities that can actually reduce emissions, in this case, by protecting more forest, improving forest management, supporting First Nations that are looking to protect more land, for example, in Clayoquot Sound, support businesses and companies that want to use eco-forestry practices, restore provincial government capacity for forest stewardship. We have lost enormous capacity in the last 20 years, and there's hardly any movement right now to restore and make sure that we actually have government staff that understand what's happening in the forest and so on the ground.
Okay, Jens, we're about 5 minutes behind now at this point. Do you have a lot more to go?
No, this is actually the slide where I will pause with this quick overview, and later I will take a moment to update folks about what the BC government is discussing right now. So we have about 5 really important strategies here to create more jobs per cubic meter and to invest and support restoration projects. All of these projects will allow us to inspire the world to take action and to maintain crucial environmental services, from protecting us from flooding and droughts, to making sure that all communities have drinking water and a high quality of life. And with this, I want to invite discussion, and we will talk more about what type of action is needed right now in a few minutes.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much, Jens. Yeah, we're going to go now to Kat from Thought Exchange, who's going to lead us through this question and answer period. And so, Kat, if you can go ahead and Jens, if you can stop sharing your screen, that will allow Kat to share hers.
Perfect, thank you. Thanks. So we're going to be using Thought Exchange to do the Q&A. So I've just popped a link into the chat, and then I'm also going to share my screen here as well. So Thought Exchange is an anonymous platform that allows you to enter your ideas and then see and rate the ideas of others. And then as a group, we'll quickly decide which questions are going to be answered. So there's different ways you can join. So you can either copy and paste the link in the chat into another browser. Unfortunately, Zoom has stopped you being able to just click into links in the chat now. The other way that you can join is if you have a smartphone handy, you can open your camera and shine that at the QR code on the screen, and that should take you to the exchange. And the final way you can join is to go to tejoin.com and enter the code that's on the screen. So just give you a couple of seconds to get into that. If you have any questions, please just drop them in the chat.
And just so everybody knows, there were several questions that were submitted in advance of the webinar, and we've already submitted those questions into the Thought Exchange. So you'll be guided through a little process to enter a little bit of information. Remember, it's all anonymous. We're not recording personal details at all. But those questions that were pre-submitted in advance, you'll be able to vote on. So we're going to try and get to the top questions so that we can answer what's most pressing to everybody here.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Elizabeth. So yeah, there'll be three quick questions, like survey style ones to answer. And then once you've answered those three, you'll be taken through to the exchange. So the first step is the share step. So you'll see a bubble there where you can go and enter the top question that you'd like to ask Mark or Jens. And then once you've added a thought, you can then click through to the star step and start rating the thoughts that you can see in the that are already added in there. So 1 is something that you really don't agree with and you're not interested in hearing about, and 5 is something that you're really interested in hearing about. Okay, so if anyone's having any problems getting in, then just drop me a note in the chat. Okay, yeah, that's great. You can see there's lots of you in there. So if you don't have a question, that's fine. You can just go straight through. You can click through to the star step once you've answered the first 3 survey questions, and you can just weigh in on other people's ideas and whether you'd like to hear about that or not. So we're just going to give this 3 minutes, and then after the 3 minutes, we'll decide what questions we're going to be hearing about. Okay, that's great.
These are some great questions.
Yeah, and what you can see on the screen here is how the conversation is just evolving in real time. So as more people start to rate and more questions come in, you'll see them start to move on the right-hand side.
Ooh, these are great questions.
Yeah, it's a shame we don't have more time.
Yeah, we'll probably have to do some type of follow-up because there are a lot of really good questions, and we'll be able to record all of these questions. So if we don't have time to answer them in the webinar today, I suspect we'll probably do some type of follow-up report back to everyone who attended the webinar so that we can get to all of your questions, because there's some really good ones here.
While we wait, I can take 1 minute to talk about biomass, because there are so many people who are asking about this right now. One reason is the movie that some people heard about, but I simply want to mention an excellent resource related to a number of forest, carbon and climate questions. A report from the former BC government ecologist Jim Poger about forest carbon myth. So this is an excellent resource looking at a number of issues, one of them burning biomass for energy, and it's on our website because we agree with the findings of his report. And maybe the most important point to make about bioenergy and biomass burning is that it's not carbon neutral in the short term to burn wood, to burn biomass, because we have emissions today when we do this, but it takes a long time. It takes decades in BC for trees to grow. And since we are in a climate crisis and we have to reduce emissions quickly, we have to make enormous progress addressing climate change within the next 10 years. This cannot be an important part of the solutions. There's a limited role for biomass when it's really about using waste, and when we really have certainty that trees are left standing when there's no greater use for them. But a lot more in this context and consistent with our position can be found in Jim Poger's report. So you can immediately find it by searching Jim Poger Sierra Club BC. It's your first hit in Google if you want to find it.
Okay, that was perfect timing. So if anyone wants to, we can, so there's one thought that's just jumped in, which doesn't have any ratings. So if you could quickly go back to the star step and start some more thoughts, then we just want to bring that one into the conversation. You can see it just hovering out there on its own, all lonely. And another one. So yeah, if people can just quickly jump in, do a little bit more starring. We'll keep this exchange open as we're going through the Q&A. So if anybody wants to carry on, participating, we can do that. Okay, so let's just have a look. So the top thought that's come out as rated by the group is this one. So what can we do as a movement / community to push the government into reducing or completely stopping the logging of old growth?
So I have 2 slides about this one. Do you want me to quickly share my screen and use them now?
Sure, Jens. We can probably do that. Yeah.
So this is related to this really quick update about what's happening with the BC government. So we are looking at 3 things here in terms of this webinar. So as most of you know, there's an old growth panel, and many of you shared their views about old growth with this panel in meetings or by email. Thank you for doing this and all the other things that many of you have done to share your views. This panel is sharing its report right now, end of April, with the BC government, and we will not see the report publicly in the next several months. Up to 6 months is now the time the BC government will take to make decisions about what steps they want to take in response to this report. So this is unfortunate, and we have to keep the pressure up for actions as soon as possible. But this is like the standard procedure. But this also means that the next weeks are incredibly important to keep reminding the BC government that British Columbians are expecting protection for endangered old growth. And similarly, the BC government has asked for support and input last year on what type of changes should be made in BC's forestry laws. And many of you submitted input using our resources last July. And these changes are apparently drafted. They were supposed to be tabled this spring. Because of COVID, this has not happened, and we are now looking at the fall. And another important topic is the ongoing lack of proactive leadership from the BC government supporting First Nations who are seeking to protect more of their land. I mentioned Clayoquot Sound as one example. The federal government is supporting nations that want to protect their land in form of indigenous protected areas, and we have not seen similar leadership from the BC government. So these are 3 examples, and we are suggesting that these weeks moving towards the summer are incredibly important to make sure that we remind the BC government we want to see action based on science. So this is a good opportunity to acknowledge the leadership shown in the context of the pandemic, but this is not the time to ignore other crises. So we need steps both from the old growth panel and in BC's forestry laws to make sure that we address the climate crisis, we address the extinction crisis, and we share the information here for Minister Donaldson and Premier Horgan. Please use this information, depending on your comfort level, to write a personal letter or make a phone call. You can leave a message if this is more comfortable for you. And we have both email and the mail address here. So personal letters really matter compared to mass communication. This is a quick overview of what you can do in terms of this question.
Thanks, Jens. And also, I do encourage phone calls. And if you're really nervous about actually talking to someone on the phone, you can always call after hours and leave a voice message, which for some people is a little less intimidating, but phone calls are also very powerful. So Jens, if you want to stop sharing your screen, we can send out this contact information after the fact. Or did you have more to address?
Only a reminder that we also have rainforestisland.ca up if you want to send a super quick email or share this with your contacts. That's another simple option for folks who have not sent a message before.
Great, thanks. Okay, let's go back to Kat and to the thought exchange screens so that we can see what the other top questions are. Okay, is this one that you've highlighted, Kat? The next top question: in what ways are tidal lands or indigenous protected areas changing the way that quote unquote forests are being managed, stewarded, protected? Mark, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that
Sorry, I'm
works.
having a bit of trouble with the mic, but just awkwardly hold it here. Well, as many people may or may not know, the vast majority of the province of British Columbia has no treaty. There's been no cessation. There's no title has not been ceded, whether you're in Wet'suwet'en or Gitxsan territory or Nuu-chah-nulth or Kwakwaka'wakw territories, which means there's disputed title there between the Crown and the different nations. And so one of the few places that we've seen different types of management in place would be the Desiko Tribal Park of the Unestateen, the Hunaka'teen, and of the Chilcotin nations, respectively, in the Chilcotin Plateau there. And so when a title case happens and is successful in the colonial courts, the 2 primary laws in BC that pertain to land and the resources in the land are namely the Parks Act and the Forest Range and Practices Act. So provincial legislation around protected and conserved areas, and then also resource extraction areas that require BC permitting, like logging. So immediately what happens is that the province no longer has jurisdiction to set the tone and the pace of forestry activities and or conservation activities. Typically what happens is forestry practices get a lot better and conservation gets a lot better at the same time. So it raises the tide of almost everything in terms of land stewardship and management right off the bat. Of course, this is a new precedent in the areas where the British Crown has asserted sovereignty in New Zealand and Australia and India and here in places. And so 2014 in that time scale is pretty recent. That was the last Chilcotin title case ruling. There's a few other that are all live right now, including the Nuchatlet Nation for what is sort of the northern half of Nootka Island. And what would happen immediately in the ways that those protected areas would change is that the Nuchatlet people would have management decisions and the final say on how they do conservation, how they manage resources in their territory, so on and so forth. So it puts the land back in the hands of Indigenous people.
Great, thank you, Mark. Okay, Kat, do you want to bring up the next top question? How do we make sure forests and forestry are forefront in a green recovery? Who wants to take that question?
I can briefly talk about this, and it seems that this is really crucial to make a strong case how the BC government can in fact create jobs by investing into forests and forestry. And I mentioned a little bit of the evidence that this actually works, but just a quick reminder. So in terms of conservation financing, in the case of the Great Bear Rainforest, we have seen the federal government, the provincial government, and private funders matching funds. And of course, it really needs leadership from one or two parties to make this happen. And it's great that the federal government has set aside 1.3 billion to support Indigenous protected areas. BC is about 10% of Canada in terms of land area. So it would be a logical step to look at matching funds with the federal government and seek additional partners to do this important, crucial work to protect globally important ecosystems and Indigenous territories. So unfortunately, we have not seen this, but it can really create jobs. In the case of the Great Bear Rainforest and Coast Funds, you can quickly find a report from Coast Funds showing some of the evidence. As a report from summer 2019, about 1,000 jobs created in the Great Bear Rainforest. And looking at forests and forestry, so again, we have to call on the BC government to really invest into value-added wood products. We need a lot more jobs for every tree cut. We need restoration, which will have a lot of benefits for things like clean water and better protection from drought. We need more government jobs, and we really have to make sure that we have a high quality of life in forest-dependent communities so that they can really have a diverse economy, so that communities on Vancouver Island and elsewhere have this added plus where businesses of all kinds want to live in these communities and start businesses in these communities because of the high quality of life and not being surrounded by clear cuts. So it's about both forestry jobs that are actually long-term jobs, not dependent on cutting down a resource that is now only available in limited supply, and a diverse economy that depends on intact ecosystems.
Great, thank you, Jens. Okay, let's see what the next question is. how does Sierra Club see the key differences between the experience in the Great Bear Rainforest and what might be possible on Vancouver Island? The land ownership question is very different, so the strategies would also need to be different. Mark, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. Well, where to begin? So the central coast of BC is a number of different First Nations territories, as is Vancouver Island, but the area between about Hamalco, Butte Inlet to Alaska, beyond Prince Rupert, is under the Great Bear Rainforest Order. So there's a whole ecosystem-based management regime that the companies are supposed to be following and adhering to, and so the professional foresters are trying to make that work in the different watersheds that they log in. And then so that is all bundled together under the Great Bear Rainforest Order and those land use objectives. On Vancouver Island, it's VLUP, or the Vancouver Island Land Use Plan, very outdated land use plan, which had always meant to be an adaptive management approach. It was supposed to be iterative. It was meant to, when in the SLRMP processes in the early 90s and stuff, it was meant to be a multi-stakeholder kind of engagement process that revisited whether certain land use objectives were working or not, and then adapted. That's the idea. That never really happened. It just asphyxiated and crystallized. So it's out of date. It doesn't include really any meaningful engagement tools for Indigenous peoples or nations, band council or hereditary in those processes. So it is just begging to be redone. Which is a mixed blessing, because of course, are we ready to do a land use planning process? Right now it's bittersweet. And of course there was a very strong critical mass of forest advocacy that was happening among grassroots communities, Indigenous communities, big and small, environmental non-governmental organizations, direct action, market-based campaigning and stuff for the Great Bear. And there was for Vancouver Island for a period too. But in a different manner, and it's created a different tone, a different tenor as well for Vancouver Island. And something that's important to remember for Vancouver Island is that we have the largest private land parcel anywhere in British Columbia. The ENN Rail Grant, which is my backyard, I was walking on the ENN Railroad this morning, is illegitimate land grant program with Lord Dunsmuir between the BC government to build the railroad that BC actually just came out with a $750 million revitalization plan for. So a huge chunk of Vancouver Island is private land, which is very problematic. And then another aspect to think about that's a little bit different for Vancouver Island is that a lot of our communities are here. There's a higher population density that live, especially on the eastern side of the island there on the Inside Passage. So that adds a layer of different land use priorities and different goals there. By and large, I would say that Vancouver Island is one of the most critical areas we need to work to improve forest practices, conservation, wildlife management improvement, almost everything. And it's also the heart of the coastal temperate rainforest, whether we're looking from Baja or Alaska, Haida Gwaii, the Central Coast, and Vancouver Island in particular is the biggest island that represents the coastal temperate rainforest. And so it's absolutely critical that we get Vancouver Island right, and that will have a domino effect in land use planning across the province.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. Okay, Kat, let's try and go to the next question. What is the most compelling storytelling that makes the links between forest and health that you know of? Oh goodness, maybe this is almost a question for Maya. Mark, do you have any thoughts? Or are you going to unmute?
Well, I won't take too much time. We can pass the mic around, but what immediately popped into my head was, I've been really lucky to work a little bit with the Nuchatlit Nation, a Nuchalnath community that lives in Ooklogie near Zabalos. Their winter home, their winter village site is Nuchatlits on Nootka Island, but because of some water supply issues years ago, they have been kind of relocated to Vancouver Island. It's on the grid. And if you talk to some of their elders in their community about why it is they're doing the title case, they're not particularly interested in having disputes with neighboring nations. You know, they have family and relations in those nations. They don't really even want to fight with the government or Western Forest Products for that matter. I'm sure they would love to work with Western Forest Products if the power dynamic wasn't so tipped and tilted towards resource extraction. But when you talk to them about why they want to go home, it's so they can eat urchin and hunt waterfowl and be happy and be in their traditional home, be where they've always remembered and known their deepest relationships with their cultures and their families. I can't think of anything healthier than that, you know? And right now, Western Forest Products is a story of 1,000 cuts to their territory where they would have derived their health and well-being from. Culturally, literally, in terms of their food sovereignty, salmon populations, you name it. And so to me, that's what popped to mind right away. That story is what moves me again and again.
Thanks, Mark. I'm also reminded of, you know, just the fact that salmon is such a critical keystone species, and in terms of like health and food security here on Vancouver Island, we don't have much food security here. And so the protection of forest, as you know, just being able to have salmon is another story. Jens, did you have anything you wanted to add around forests and health, or?
Only that I'm really inspired by the many stories I see from people who are realizing that right about now, because of this pandemic, how much it matters to them to have nature close to home, and that the whole question of health and having intact natural spaces is really very personal for people right now. And we see that everywhere, also with the examples of how people are really hopeful about all the examples of animals coming back into certain spaces, because all of a sudden nature has a little bit more room to come back. There are lots of places, both in cities and outside of cities, where people are moving less, polluting less, and nature is coming back strong. And it's really inspiring and important for people and their health.
That's
and
fabulous.
I'll just jump in real quick too, because I love this question. I'm the communications specialist at Sierra Club BC and a storyteller myself. And yeah, you guys are making great points. There's so many connections between forests and our health, and so many different stories we can tell, from food security and Indigenous cultural health, mental health. So many studies have created that connection between the time spent outside to reduce stress and just help with overall well-being. And that's not even touching on water quality and air quality that forests help create. And we're really excited to be diving more into these stories and shining a light on all these threads in the future for Sierra Club BC.
That's great. Thank you so much, Maya, for adding that. So that actually leads me into the next thing, which is we only had time to run through this first thought exchange on this webinar, and we actually are hoping to pose an additional question to you to help submit your ideas. So we'll be emailing a link for you to participate in a second thought exchange. We'll be continuing to monitor the one that's up here and maybe even type some responses to some of the questions that we didn't get to today. But I really do hope that you'll be able to join us in the second discussion that we will be talking about, specifically what we need to be thinking about as we move forward as an organization in light of how COVID-19 is really changing the way that we're going to be doing our work. So we have to wrap up pretty soon. So I want to say thank you to all of our panelists, and Kat from Thought Exchange, and Maya, thanks for joining us and offering your thoughts there. I do encourage all of you, if you're not currently a member of Sierra Club BC, we do need your financial support as well. I strongly encourage you to sign up with a small monthly donation. Even $5 or $10 a month really makes a huge difference for us to have some kind of financial security so that we can adapt to the pandemic as well. And yeah, just look for a follow-up email from us. We'll continue the conversation, and thank you all for your time today. Thanks so much, everybody.